Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Mark, and I'm going to be with you this afternoon. So thank you all for joining us. And I'm coming to you this afternoon from an unusually sunny and unusually warm South Wales, so near Cardiff. So if we could start, as always, if you can post in the comments where you are, that would be great. So we've already got Dominique here, who's in Ontario in Canada. So welcome. I'm sure it's a bit colder there than it is here. Welcome. Let's see, who else have we got? We've got Lily from England. So welcome, Lily. Hello. And we've got Mena from Egypt. Welcome again, Mena. Hello there in Hong Kong. Welcome. Anita from Peterborough. Afternoon to you, Anita. Right. Okay, so it's not too cold there at the moment. All right, good. Okay, so let's get started. So this afternoon, we are going to be talking about classroom management. Okay. So classroom management is something that, especially for new teachers, and the first time that they've been in the classroom, it's probably something that can be quite daunting because they think about how they're going to deal with behavior issues and things like this. And when you talk to people who haven't been in the classroom before, the thing that they are most concerned about seems to be classroom management and how they're going to deal with any behavior problems. And then often when you talk to them a bit more, the classes that then they are most concerned about tend to be teenagers. So conversations I've had with people over the years, it's generally class of teenagers that they're most concerned about or most reluctant to teach. However, in reality, it's not necessarily correct to say that the most behavior issues are going to come from teenage classes. Certainly in my experience over the years, I've had probably as many issues with adult classes as with teenagers. So it's important to think about how to deal with issues in different classes. Because obviously, if there's a problem in an adult class, you can't deal with it in the same way as you would a teenager or a child. So whilst, yes, of course, there can be issues with teenagers, classes of teenagers, when you get it right and you build up the relationship, classes can be really good fun. So the key is careful planning and thinking about what you want to achieve. So before you start teaching, you need to consider who it is that you're going to be teaching. Don't just think about the class, think about the individuals in that class. Because of course, everyone is going to be different. And actually, even if you have a class who you think generally you have behavior issues with, even within that class of disruptive students, you will always have a few students who are still really well behaved and still trying to get on and really nice to teach. So always think about them as individuals and deal with them as individuals. That's really important. Try and understand why the students are there and what motivations they have. And that, of course, links back to what I said about having issues with adult classes as much as teenagers. because an adult might be sent to an English class by their company, for example, to improve their English for their work. So they might not be very motivated to be there. They might not really see the point. And so that can make them quite a difficult learner. Different ages bring different considerations as well. So it could be if you that you teach very young learners who are typically around 4 to 5 years old. It's likely that they're not going to know the language and will have very limited experience of being in the classroom. So here it's important to keep the activities very short, just a couple of minutes, and activities that involve lots of repetition. Materials should be visual, so as well as videos and songs, and it's likely that there should not be any reading or writing at this age. Then you go on to young learners who are typically around 6 to 12 years old, and they by that stage usually have some experience of being in the class and will also have some English skills. I mean, in fact, by the time they're 11 or 12, they could have very high levels of English, and I've seen that in the past with groups that I've taught. So it's important to consider that. But even so, even if their language is at a very high level, you still have to remember that they're still children. So activities do still need to be quite short and engaging. And the materials still need to be age appropriate, regardless of how good their English is. You have to remember as well that what interests a 6-year-old is unlikely to have the same interest for an 11-year-old. In fact, for those older children, it could make them switch off, disengage from the class, and not want to be involved. So it's important to get those materials right for each class. Then you've got teenager classes who are typically sort of 12 to 13 up to somewhere around 16. And as with young learners, there's going to be a wide variety of ability from beginners up to advanced. Teenagers, of course, should be able to focus on tasks for longer than young learners, and they should be able to deal with more complex ideas. However, your lessons still need to be engaging and varied to keep their interest. Teenagers as well, remember, tend to be a bit more self-conscious. So where your young learners up to around the age of sort of 10 or 11, it's important that the teacher is pleased with their work. So they want the adult that they are dealing with to be happy with them. Once you get to teenagers, that's not what's important. Is actually their friendship group, it's their peers and what their peers think of them that's important. So you need to consider that. Adults, as the name suggests, tend to be anyone over the age of around 16 or 18. It depends on the institution you're working in. Adults can be false beginners to advanced and may be learning English for a wide variety of reasons. So it could be personal, it could be study, or it could be work. Adults tend to need to see things written down, and they need to be more confident that they're correct before they're willing to say something. So whereas with children and with young learners and perhaps even low-level teenagers, a lot of the things that you do would be spoken and listening. With adults, it's really important, and they're not going to feel confident until they've seen something written down. So also before teaching, you need to think about your classroom rules. So it's a good idea to decide what your rules are going to be before you go into class. And think about what you want to happen in your classroom. So think about what behavior you will accept and what you won't. So decide that and then stick to it. And of course, within those, you also have to look at the rules of the organization that you're teaching in and what expectations they have for students. So if the institution, if the organization says that there's not to be mobile phones used in class, then you can't really do something different. And the reason for that is, while it may be fine in your class, it affects other people's classes. Okay, so look at those rules, but also decide what you want and how you want people to behave in your class. But what's really important going along with this is not just to think about rules. It's actually to think about activities and tasks that you're going to give your students, making sure that you give them things that are going to engage them and keep them working rather than messing around. So if you give them work that they finish too quickly, and if you have students who are waiting for other people to finish, then they're likely to get bored and distracted. So it's important to give them something to do. If you give them work that's too challenging and they can't complete it, then they're likely to give up and then become distracted. So think about that. Think about the activities that you're going to do. So now during the lesson, you want to agree the rules really within the first lesson, certainly within the first couple of lessons. So a good way to do this is to divide your class into groups. And in those small groups, get them to discuss what they think the classroom rules should be, or the classroom contract, what they think it should be, and get them to discuss and come up with ideas together. And once they've done that, bring them all back together as one class, elicit their ideas and write them up on the board. Remember that before the lesson, you already thought about the rules and you decided what rules you want to have. So at this point, you listen to what your students are saying. If the rule is good and it fits with what you wanted, you write it up on the board. If it's close to what you were thinking, you can just slightly rephrase it, put it up on the board. If it's something that's far away from what you want and obviously not meant to be taken seriously, then it's just like, okay, yeah, that's a really good idea. Perhaps we'll come back to that later and then move on to someone else. Okay. By eliciting the rules from your students, you're engaging them in that process. They're more likely to follow the rules because they feel that they've had an input into them rather than the rules being dictated to them by someone else. At the end of this process, get the students to copy the rules into their book, or if you can, get a large sheet of paper so the rules are written up on there rather than on the whiteboard. Write the rules up on the sheet of paper. Then perhaps you could get your students all to sign at the bottom of the sheet of paper, and then you can keep that on your classroom wall so it's always visible. Some teachers will encourage their students to think about rules for the teacher as well. These are usually things like not doing not giving too much homework, not shouting, or things like this. Some teachers like this, like I say, and others don't. Personally, I don't. I want to get on with my students, and I think that building a really good relationship is important. And the most fundamental way of dealing with any behavior issues in class actually is to build relationships. If you have a good relationship with your students, you are less likely to have any behavior issues. So I think that that's really important. But also, I want my students, especially teenagers, I want them to understand that there is some separation between me as the teacher and them. So it doesn't mean that I'm better than them, that I know more than them or anything like that. But there is a separation so that when I have to tell them to do something, they do it. Okay. And I feel that by getting them to give rules makes us more at the same level. Okay. So I prefer not to do that. What you will see with lots of things that we discuss when we talk about classroom management, whether it's in this webinar or whether it's things that you read online or talk about with other people, what you'll find is there are lots of different ways of dealing with classroom management. And as long as you are trying, there isn't necessarily a right way or a wrong way. There are just different ways because we're all different. And so you will find a way of dealing with classroom management which best suits your personality. So listen, take on board all of the ideas that you see and you hear and you read in different places. But remember that what works for me, for example, might not work for you. Here's an example of a classroom contract. This is one that I've created, and I've used this for probably more than 15 years, actually. What's important is the rules need to be really, really clear and really simple. Now, we want to be quite polite and perhaps creating some distance between us and the rules. So it will be things like, I'll try not to, avoid using your mobile phone or things like this. Trying to use quite nice, polite language and things. Well, actually, with the rules, and especially when you're teaching language learners, you want to be really clear, really direct. So you can see that the bullet points that I've got here are all really, really simple, okay? So that they're easy for everyone to understand. And actually, you will find that your students, whether they're children, teenagers, or adults, they're going to come up with something very similar to this. Okay. So now during the lesson, so during class, the first thing, and probably again one of the most important things, is to be consistent. Your students, and especially teenagers, will understand very clearly if they don't think that you are being fair. And if they think that you're not being fair, they will tell you, and this can lead to a bigger conflict and bigger issues. So if they think that you are treating one person differently, or if they think that you're treating one class differently to another, then they will mention that, and they're not going to be happy about it. It's going to make them less likely to do what you're asking. Stick to the agreed rules. So you've done this task where you've got them in groups, you've elicited the rules from them. You can't then add more rules later on. Okay, so they're your rules. That's what you've agreed. That's what you've got to stick to. You can't add any after. As much as possible, use positive reinforcement. If a student is constantly being told off or punished, there's very little point in trying to be good because they know that they're going to get told off anyway. So sometimes it can be a really good idea as a teacher to just take a step back, or actually think to yourself before you go into the class, I need to find something positive that this person has done today. And it could be something really small. Okay, as you're walking around, they've answered 3 questions. Oh, well done! You've done 3 questions. Excellent. Well done. And they're all right. That's brilliant. Well done. Lots of positive reinforcement. Okay, doing things like that rather than constantly telling them off. Don't lecture the class if you have to deal with behavior. So if you're dealing with a discipline issue, deal with it quickly and then move on. If you lecture the class, so I've seen a teacher basically stand at the front of the class and lecture them for 30 minutes about how bad their behavior is and going on. And the class, of course, just get bored. They switch off. They're not engaged at all. And then as soon as the teacher stops talking, they revert back to that behavior that the teacher didn't like. So deal with any behavior issues as quickly as possible. If it's one person, rather than telling them off from the front of the class, go to that person, go down to their levels. It's like kneel down so you're at their level, and then talk to them quietly about their behavior. Okay, you're much less likely to get conflict by doing it that way than if you are standing at the front telling them off. So do try to do things like that. What I've found over the years that I've been teaching is that students need boundaries, especially teenagers. So when you've got a new class, after the first week or so, they'll start pushing the limits. They're looking to see what they can get away with. So it's like, oh, when you say no mobile phones in class, what do you mean? If I just check my phone, would I get in trouble for that? If I just send a quick text message and say it's my mum, would I get into trouble for that? So they're testing the boundaries. All right. So have your boundaries and stick to them. It might give you a difficult couple of lessons, but in the end, it's going to help you and it's going to benefit all of your students, because once they know where those boundaries are, they are going to stay within them. A lot of behavior issues come up in class when the students don't know where the boundaries are because the teacher isn't consistent, for example. Make sure to think about how you want to start and end the class. So I generally start my classes by doing the register and checking homework, even if I'm not going through and correcting the homework because it's a piece of written work, for example. I will just go around and say, right, can you show me your homework? Can you show me your homework? Can you show me your homework? I do this for a few reasons. First of all, it acts as a signpost for my students that they can see that now the class is starting. We need to get into the right frame of mind for our class. And also for me, because if I didn't do that, the likelihood is I'll forget about homework. And then, of course, you'll have students say, well, if my teacher doesn't check my homework, why am I going to do it? Which I think is a fair point. So I start the class like that. So I do the register, say hello to everyone. And what I like to do as well is actually I'll get to class a few minutes early. And then as people are arriving, I can just have a chat with them as well. So do the register, check homework. And then at the end of the class, I'll get everyone to pack away, make sure the classroom is tidy, get them to put their chairs under the table, and then I will let them leave according to how I want. And I generally don't have the whole class just going at once. Generally, it will be me saying who can go. And it's usually based on me. It could be a game that we've played, or it could be behavior or things like this. But however I do it, I always try to get them to leave in an organized way so that it just creates a better atmosphere in the classroom. So it's important that you think about what you're saying to your students when you are in class. There's no point in making a threat that you either can't or won't carry out. For example, if you tell a student that you'll get them removed from the school if they don't do what you say, but you don't have the authority to do that, it's going to weaken your authority. Don't humiliate your students. So, like I said before, rather than talking across the classroom to tell them about behaviour, go and talk to them quietly. Focus on their behaviour rather than the student, and like I say, as much as possible, speak to them quietly, speak to them privately, so that they're not the focus of other people's attention. It's important as well to be fair, and the thing is that you have to be aware of your own feelings. As much as we want to be cheerful all the time, it's not always possible. Okay. And I know this myself. Sometimes I go into class and it's just, as much as I like the class, I'm just feeling a little bit grumpy that day, and it can be a little bit hard work to get going. But also, it's not your student's fault if something has happened outside the classroom. Okay. So if you were stuck in traffic, on the way to school, and it means you didn't have time to sort of prepare material, think about what you want to do, grab that cup of coffee before you start, those sort of things. Or you've had issues at home before you left, or you've got to work and you've had some unreasonable demands from your boss or something. All of these things can happen. None of them are your students' fault. So it's really not fair to take it out on them. So just be aware of your own feelings and your own behavior as well, and try and always remain professional and be objective. If you have a student who you seem to be constantly having to speak to about their behavior, stop and think for a moment and try and see if they're actually behaving worse than other people in the class. Or is it perhaps you're too focused on their behavior for some reason? Try and have a look. Like I said earlier on, is there something that you can praise them for? Is there something, and it might just be a tiny little thing, but is there something you can praise them for doing well? And then finally, admitting mistakes. Teachers are humans. We're all human, and we all make mistakes. So what's important is if you make a mistake, don't be embarrassed. Don't try and cover it up. Just admit your mistake. Apologize if you need to, and it actually creates a much better atmosphere. It creates a really good atmosphere, because suddenly, in the eyes of your students, you're human. You're the same as them. You're telling them about things they do wrong, and here you are saying, "Oh, do you know what? I just got that wrong." All right. Suddenly they see you the same as everyone else. And don't worry about it. I've got one student, he was doing some work. This was a couple of weeks ago. He was doing some work, and I was looking over his shoulder at the work he was doing. And I said to him, "Well, I think you'll find you spelled disease wrong." It was disease. And he was writing away and everything else, and it just, because of his handwriting, it just didn't look right. So, and he was like, "Well, how do you spell it then?" So I said, "Oh, like this." So I got a piece of paper, wrote down disease, and I spelled it correctly. Okay, English teacher, over 20 years experience, and I just spelled it incorrect. I just put it on the paper, and this was a few weeks ago. I've seen him a few times since then. Every lesson, he reminds me. He's still got that piece of paper. So, yes, okay, fine. It doesn't matter. These things happen. So now we're thinking about what happened, thinking about after the lesson now. So after the lesson, it's important to be reflective about the class itself, and think about how the lesson went. You might want to keep a note of your thoughts to refer back to later. Start by thinking what went well in the class. If there was a task that the students were fully engaged in, what was it about that task that went well? If your students did everything you asked, why was that? What was it about that class? Even if you had a class that you feel was absolutely a terrible class for whatever reason, still have a think through the class and think, well, there must be something that went well in that class. So what was good about it? And then, of course, think about things that didn't go so well, and think about why it didn't go as planned. And sometimes it can be a task that worked brilliantly with one class and just completely fails in another class, or an activity that you've spent a long time planning and you think, "Oh, this is going to be great. It's going to work really well." And then you go into class and it just fails completely. All right. So you need to think about why that is. You've put all that time and effort into that activity. So you need to think about why it didn't go well. To think, was there a problem with the instructions? Was the task too complicated for the class? Did the task need breaking down? And sometimes that can be a good thing to look at. If you've got a really good task, perhaps you just need to block it more. So you give instructions for one part, they do that, and you give them instructions for the next bit, and you just move on like that. So maybe breaking it down, that could be something that would work well. Perhaps the task wasn't appropriate for the age of the students. Like we talked about earlier on, are you giving teenagers something that's more suitable for 7 or 8 year olds? So that's why they don't like it. There are also things that are going to be outside your control. So things that have happened in school, things that have happened in other classes, even the weather can affect your students. If it's a windy day, then that can affect them. If you live somewhere where there's snow, and often the first day of snow can affect students as well, as it probably affects their teachers as at the same time. And also think about the issues that you had with a class or individual students, and think about why you had those issues. Were they unusual for that class? So is it a class that normally behaves really well, and today you had a problem? A student perhaps who is normally pretty good, that today you just couldn't get them to do what you wanted. Perhaps the class or the student is just having an off day. Perhaps you're having an off day. So think about how, if there was a problem, how did you deal with it? Could you have done anything differently? Could you have reacted to that student's behavior in a different way, or that class's behavior in a different way, that would have made the situation a little bit better? So think about what you could change next time you teach that lesson. Rather than blaming. So quite often when I've been with teachers, you quite often hear them talking about bad classes or bad students, and certainly that can be true. There can be classes that are more difficult. There can be students who are more difficult to work with. But as a teacher and as the adult in the class, it's your responsibility to do as much as you can to create a positive environment. So rather than blaming the bad class or bad students, think about your own actions and think about what you could do differently. Even if it is a really bad student, a really badly behaved student, think about, right, okay, well, I did this today and that didn't work. So next lesson, I'm going to try this and see if this works. See if I can engage the student that way. Looking at the activities, make sure the activities are all appropriate. Is there anything that you could do differently that would help the class work better? And finally, as much as possible, don't shout. I know sometimes it can be quite difficult to do, but really the best thing to do is don't shout. Once we start shouting, it's really showing loss of control. And if you've got a class of students who are pushing boundaries, if they're looking for a reaction, which is quite often what behavior is about, it's about looking for a reaction. If you react, then they've got what they want. And so they can think to themselves, right, what can we do next time to get that reaction? And I've seen and I've heard classes of students behave in this way towards a particular teacher, because they know that they're going to react in some kind of adverse way. The most important thing to remember is to not be afraid to talk about any issues you have. Talk to other teachers in the staff room. And actually that can be as simple as, going to the staff room, and being like, oh, I've just had, class 8 and, oh, they were horrendous today. I don't know what's wrong with them. And another teacher will say, oh, yeah, I had them as well. And they were awful for me as well. Just that little conversation like that actually can make you feel much better. All right. So don't keep it to yourself. Do talk to other teachers. When you're in a classroom, you often feel that perhaps you're the only person having these issues. But that's not the case. That's not true. There will be other people with similar issues. So do talk to teachers, get advice, ask other people how they deal with this class or this student or this behavior. That's a really important thing to do. Okay, so now we're over to you for the Q&A session. So in the chat, if you could write any questions you've got about classroom management, and we will get through as many as we can. So if you write your questions now. Let's see what questions you've got. We often think about, we talk about bad students or bad behavior, but in my experience, there's very few actually bad students. Often there's a reason for the way that they're behaving the way they are. So it's trying to find that reason, it's trying to solve that problem. Okay, we've got a nice question here. Okay. Right. Okay, that wasn't the question, but we'll come back to that one in a second. So this question here, how do you deal with listed rules that you don't want to include? Okay, so very, very quickly. Okay, so you're listing the rules, you've got them up on the board. You would say, right, I don't know, Dennis, what do you think? And he says, oh, we shouldn't have any homework. So, oh, okay, that sounds like a great idea, Dennis. Maybe we'll come back to that later. Sasha, what do you think? Okay, so dealing with it just quickly and then quickly moving on. Okay, so that's a great question. Thank you. Right, so this question. How do you recover from a task that has failed or is failing during the lesson? Thanks for this question. It's a really good question. Oh yeah, this is this will happen. If you are a new teacher and you haven't started teaching yet, this is going to happen to you. You will be in class and you will have a great activity that you've planned and it just will not be working. So sometimes the best thing to do is to just stop the activity. Say, right, okay, this task isn't working. We're going to go on and we're going to do something else. Okay. Sometimes you can almost feel, I don't know, perhaps like you're drowning or something like that. Okay. Well, in that case, the best thing to do, you need to give yourself a moment to think, right, okay, what am I going to do? So give your students a task, whether it's talking in pairs, talking in groups, something like that, so that the focus is off of you for a moment. You can think, right, how am I going to solve this? And then move on. Okay. You cannot be talking to the class, dealing with issues and thinking about what you're going to do next. It's really hard to do that. Okay. So yeah, take a step back, allow yourself a moment to breathe and think about the next step. And like I say, if a task isn't working, just stop it, bring it to an end, move on to something else. Okay, so students are learning English. So first of all, thank you for your comment that you enjoyed listening to the guidelines. That's great, thank you. If the students are learning English and they don't know much English, how will you get the classroom rules, etc. done? So if they're absolute beginners, so I said, like, if they're like 4 or 5 years old, something like that, I wouldn't do classroom rules with them. Okay, there's no point. You're not really going to have any discipline issues in any case. So I wouldn't do it. Older students, they are going to have been in a classroom situation before. So they are going to know what expectations are. So you're going to help them with the language by giving them pointers. So it'll be things like, oh, what about mobile phones? What can we say about mobile phones? You know, giving them pointers like that and giving them direction. And of course, because you're having them work in small groups to come up with the rules, it's much easier to go around and give those pointers, perhaps organizing your groups so that you've got slightly stronger students with slightly weaker ones who can help them. Okay. But by and large, they're going to understand what the expectations are in any case. So thank you for that. It's a great question. Let's have a look at the next one. So could these pointers be applied to online teaching as well? Absolutely. So anything about classroom, in fact, yes, all the things we talked about. So the rules, how you deal with students, thinking about yourself, the types of activities you do and whether they work and why they don't work. All of these things are going to be equally important if you're teaching online as if you're teaching face to face. So absolutely, these can be applied in the same way. Okay. So any advice on where a child has mental health issue or learning difficulties, but there's no extra teaching assistant help? Okay, so this can be quite a difficult one. I mean, generally, I'd say if you're teaching English as a foreign language, the likelihood is you're going to be teaching smaller classes than perhaps you imagine. You know, if you've taught in a state school or you've, of course, been in a state school, the likelihood is you're going to be teaching smaller classes than those. So it's going to be easier for you to give more directed attention to students. Okay. And apart from that, it's speaking in that case to whoever your line manager is. So if you are having issues, if there are particular things that you need, then you know, asking for that help and asking for that extra assistance if that's what you need. What can you do with a student who dominates by trying to give all the answers? Someone who wants approval but doesn't want the others have a chance. Okay. Well, the first thing to remember is that this student is doing what you want. They're participating in your class. They are involved in your lesson. So actually, they are trying to do the right thing. When you're teaching young learners, you are going to have students like this. You are going to have, you know, if you're teaching young learners, then it's going to happen. If you're teaching younger teenagers, then it's a very good chance that you're going to have perhaps a more immature person in that class who is going to behave like this. So in this case, be positive. However you deal with a student, deal with it in a really positive, friendly way. Okay. So it could be that when you ask questions, you nominate people to answer rather than just allowing anyone. Or you could do hands up. You could, yeah. So, for example, if you nominate people, so if you say, "Oh, Jane, what's the answer?" Possibly this student is still going to answer, going to call out. So in that case, I'm like, "Oh, so Jane, what's the answer?" This person calls out, "Oh, how many people are called Jane in our class today? Let's try again. Jane, what's the answer?" So making a little bit of a joke of it. All right. Another thing you say is, "Oh, John, you know, you've worked really hard. You're working so solidly today. Well done. That's great. I don't want you to answer any more questions for this part of the class because I want to get all the others working as well." Okay. You can try things like that. All right. Just whatever you do, make sure it's really nice and positive. In every class, there is that one student who'd set the whole classroom into chaos. What to do with this student? I tried praising them for their good behaviour. Once I praise them, they revert back. Okay, so this depends a little bit, I think, on the age of the students. So this has happened to me. So I was teaching a class of teenagers. They were about 14 at the time, I think. And there was about 8 of them in the class, and they were actually all boys. And I'd been teaching them for a few years. They knew me really well. And so there were no issues with behavior at all. They were great. I really enjoyed teaching them. And then in September, we had a new boy join the class. And he was dreadful. His behavior was so different to everyone else. We'd all got so used to each other, and he just came in and he just was completely different. So I had a few lessons of just dealing with the behavior in the way that I normally would do, and it wasn't really having any effect. And so after a few lessons, I said to him, "Oh, can you just stay behind for a few minutes after class?" So I got him to stay behind, and I sat down with him and I said, "Right, okay, what's going on? What seems to be the problem? Because we seem to be having a few issues in class." I said to him, "Do you not want to be here?" And he said, "No, I don't. I don't want to be here. My parents are making me come." I was like, "Right, okay, all right, that's fair enough, and I can understand that. You know, you're 14 years old. You probably want to be off with your friends, playing football or playing computer games, whatever it is. There's a lot more things that you think would be more interesting than learning English. I completely get that. But at the moment, your parents are sending you, and they're going to keep sending you. And there's probably not much discussion in that. And when you come here and you don't do what I ask you to, I'm going to have to deal with that. So perhaps what you could do, you know, perhaps if you try and behave and if you try and do the work that I ask in class, then perhaps you might enjoy it a little bit and you might get something from it. It might not be so bad." And that's how I spoke to him. I just sat down and I spoke to him and I treated him like an adult. And his behavior after that probably wasn't perfect, but it was a massive improvement. Okay, it really did help. It really did make a great change. And it affected the way that we were able to speak to each other as well. It made it much easier for him to speak to me and me to speak to him if I needed to. Okay. So try something like that. Can really help. So other things for that, another thing you can do is what you tend to do, the way that classes go, is you tend to have your main like speaking activity, your fun activity at the end of the lesson. So perhaps you could have some written exercises for that student. So, do you know what? Because you disrupted us and it was difficult for us to get through what we had to do, I want you to do this work now rather than doing this task. So maybe try that once or twice as well and see if that helps. Okay, do you think it's a good idea to give homework or revision to students after every lesson? Yes, I do. And my students don't like it. But I have students who I perhaps only see once a week for 1 hour once a week. And so I say to them, look, and they'll say, I haven't got time to do homework because I've got revision, I've got piano lessons, I've got football practice, and my life is so full. And I say, yeah, I understand that, but I'm not asking you to do 5 hours of homework. I'm asking you to do 30 minutes homework. And the thing is, I only see you once a week, and that's not enough time for us to go through all the things that we need to do. And so I need to give you homework. And also another way that I focus it is that in class, we tend to do speaking activities, we do listening activities, reading activities, and things like that. And what my students tend to do for homework are writing tasks. And the way I frame that is, the little time that we have together is not a good use of time if you're writing and I'm just standing here or sitting here watching you write. We don't get very much from that. Of course, there are other things I can do. I could go around and help people and nudge them in the right direction and things like that. But when I'm explaining the homework reasoning, that's how I frame it. So doing that, that really helps. But yeah, homework is good. Okay. Right, so you're a teenager whose attention span is very short, tends to lose attention. Right, okay, so what you could do, for example, if you have a gap fill task, for example, what you could do for that student is to divide up the task. So rather than having a sheet of A4, it's perhaps divided in 3 sections. You give them the first section, they complete it, they come to you, so they have to stand up, and wherever you are, sort of make sure that you're somewhere that you can deal with them. They come to you, you check their work, you give them the next piece, they go back, they do that, they come back. So that is giving them that break. Okay. Some people do have very short attention spans. Some people do find it very difficult to focus on something for a long period of time. And so what we need to do is, as teachers, is to help them manage it, help them to find ways of extending the time that they concentrate for as much as is possible for them, and also find ways of avoiding them interrupting the class. So it might be, so I might say to them, okay, well, I understand that you could, you can only do 2 or 3 questions and then you're distracted. That's absolutely fine. So I want you to have a look at the clock, check the time, and I want you to write for 1 minute. And after 1 minute, I want you to stop. And I don't want you to distract anyone around you. I don't want you to, but I just want you to stop, and you can like gaze out the window. You can come and ask me a question if you want. And then I want you, after 2 minutes, I want you to go back and I want you to do another minute's work and get them to work like that. Okay. Pointing out what the issue is and showing them different ways of dealing with it will really help them. Okay. You say they're interrupting the class with irrelevant things. So you could just like not pay attention to that, so they see that now's not the time. So if you're explaining something to the class and they say something that's irrelevant, so all right, okay, we'll talk about that later, and then you carry on. But then another time when they say something which is still irrelevant, but actually it's an all right time, give them a couple of minutes and then carry on with the class, so that they start to learn that actually there is 1 or 2 times. Okay. And even sometimes I will go to class early with, for students like this, because they tend to be there one of the first and one of the last to leave. So I tend to get there a few minutes early so I can talk to them before the class. After the class, I'll talk to them as well, not about behavior or class or anything, just, what you do at the weekend, or how's football going, how are your exams going, things like that. So they start to see that there are places in the class where they can have these conversations and they can let off steam. Okay. I hope that helped. All right. Have we got any other questions? It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't look like we do. I'll give you another minute or so if you've got any questions to put them up on the comments. the thing that I've noticed over all the time that I've been teaching is that quite often people will be almost afraid of teaching children and teenagers. If you have the opportunity to teach them, even 4-year-olds, right? I've taught 4.5-year-olds. It's brilliant. It's amazing. I really, really enjoyed it. If you have the opportunity, go for it. Give it a go. See how you get on. You might surprise yourself, and it might be much more enjoyable than you expected. And like I said, when things do go wrong, or if things go wrong, make sure you talk to people about it. And make sure that you're able to share your experiences with other people. All right, I've got one last question here. What's the best way to assert your authority as a teacher? Okay. Like I said, everyone will find different ways of dealing with it. So, for example, I said the importance of not shouting. So if you're trying to get a class to be quiet, for example, and you say to them, right, okay, everyone stop talking now so we can start the class, and they're still talking. If you try and shout over them, what you're doing is increasing the volume level in the class. They're going to talk. So the volume gets even louder in the class. So I do something which I originally saw a teacher when I was at school do, and I do it in obviously a slightly different way now because we have different technologies. So I ask the class to be quiet, and I give them a few moments to hear the instruction, understand what I've asked them to do, and follow the instruction. Once they don't do that, I just go to the computer at the front of the class. I put in Google. If you put into Google like stopwatch, it will bring up a stopwatch on Google. And if I've got, the whiteboard, I can put the screen up there. I throw it up on the screen, and I start the stopwatch. And then when the class, I don't say anything to them. At this point now, I stopped talking, okay? Thrown the stopwatch up on the wall, and then I just stand at the front and I wait. And what will happen is someone will notice me standing and waiting. They'll notice the stopwatch and and it will go around the class and everyone will stop talking. And once they've stopped, you stop the stopwatch, put the time off the board, and you say, right, okay, that's the amount of time that you're going to stay after class, or you're going to come back at break time and things like that. You only have to do this a couple of times because then somebody will see you writing stopwatch in Google and they say, he's getting a stopwatch. And the class will be silent. And that's what you want. So yeah, just trying things like that. Shouting doesn't actually work. In some ways, actually, being quieter and lowering your voice can actually have a better outcome than shouting. Okay, so doing things like that. I talked earlier on about not going on about the behavior, dealing with it quickly and moving on. So unfortunately, students can get used to or have a lot of experience of teachers who stay focused on bad behavior and they have a grudge. So actually, if you can deal with the behavior, move on, show that it's not affected you, show that you're not angry or annoyed or upset about their behavior, then it's going to create that really good classroom atmosphere. All right. And you're going to get them to do what you want. Also, like I said, talking to them. So like you've got your classroom rules. So, keep the students safe. You say, right, look, we've got the rules here and you've put your name there that you agree with them. So why are you not following the rules? Okay. And speak to them like that. And then when you are agreeing that they're not going to do that again, you get them to agree. So rather than telling them, don't do that again. You say to them, right, you're not going to do this again, are you? And you get them to agree, yeah, I'm not going to do that again. Okay, so do things like that. Right, good. This will be the last question, I think, unfortunately, because we're out of time. But what are positive ways to say no or not that way to beginners? Right. The thing with this is that if they're beginners, they have very limited knowledge of the language. And so you want to be as clear as possible so that they understand. And so actually, no, for example, is very clear, very simple to understand. So perhaps to start off with, you will just use simple language like that. And then as your students become more used to you, then you can make your phrases more polite and more friendly and all of these things that we want to do as teachers in class. But actually, to start off with, keep them really simple. And not that way. That's really clear, actually. They're going to know exactly what you mean. So there really isn't a problem with using that language when you're starting classes with beginners. Okay. Great. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I see there's still a few questions here that have come in, or we really don't have time to answer them, unfortunately, which is a real shame. You've all been great again this afternoon, so thank you very much. As always, we have the questionnaire for the webinar, so it'd be really great if you could spend a couple of minutes filling in that questionnaire so that we've got some ideas of what you'd like to see in the future. That would be great. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day or rest of your evening, and hopefully we'll see you again here soon. So thank you very much, and goodbye, everyone.